So I want to introduce to you right now America's best climate prediction expert, John L. Casey, author as well.
Good evening. How are you? Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. Again, I was here 3 years ago. Things have changed since then. All right, thanks again. The presentation tonight, I hope you will find informative, but more than that, I hope you will find it so comprehensively informative that you act on what you hear tonight, because I think this could very well be the most important, most impactful climate change briefing you will ever hear in your life, if not the most important presentation you hear in your life. We're going to talk about some very profound changes that are occurring with the sun and our climate, things you have not heard before. And before I get into the details, I want to thank everyone here specifically and the Tea Party folks for Greater Orlando and the Tea Party organizations around the U.S. I have given many, many presentations on this subject, and I am deeply thankful for what y'all are doing individually and as a group to support the U.S. Constitution, to take back rights, individual rights, property rights, political rights that have somehow eroded over the last decades. Now's the time to stand up, and you have been standing up, and I want to personally thank you very much for doing so. This is our agenda tonight. I'm going to give you right up front the most important message. You will know the meat of this discussion tonight. We're going to talk about the Space and Science Research Corporation. I'm going to bring you current with the latest winter weather that we're seeing in our country, and I'll distinguish that from the climate. We're going to talk about what's really happening, an overall picture of the Earth's climate status. We're going to talk, most importantly, about the new cold epoch that has begun and what that means to us. Many of you have heard of the recent report from NOAA and NASA that suggests that 2014 was the warmest year ever recorded, certainly this past century. The answer is no, it was not, according to our research, and I'll explain why. But I'll also explain why we all need to pay a lot of attention to what really happened with global temperatures, because they did go up, there was a spike in warming, and I'll explain what that means. And of course, the question I get the most in these presentations is, how do we prepare for this new cold era that's coming? Since global warming ended years ago, which I'll explain, we do have a new cold era and we need to prepare. I have a lot of slides to get through, a lot of data. I'll try to go as quickly as I can, but I want to reserve a lot of time, if I may, for question and answer afterwards. So hold your questions, make a mental note or write it down. I'll get to your questions later. This is the meat of our presentation, ladies and gentlemen. The number one component of it is our sun is the primary driver of climate change, not mankind's CO2, no way, not even close. The sun is now and always has been the prime force in climate variation. And right now that sun of ours is going through a 206-year cycle switchover from past global warming to a new climate change of global cooling. This global cooling is going to be severe. In fact, the most likely outcome from this will be record cold weather for the next few decades, massive global crop damage, and resultant civil strife, political upheaval, and significant loss of life on our planet. This will be history in the making. You will be living through it. It will happen within the next few years so that everyone knows it's coming. But the bottom of the cold cycle is late 2020s and 2030s. It'll last for 2 decades. This has happened before. This 206-year cycle repeats like clockwork. It's going to happen again. There's nothing that we can do about it. There is no amount of legislation that can be passed, no amount of taxes that we can pay that will change what's happening with the sun, because the sun is the most powerful force in our solar system, and it does what it wants to do. So we're going to talk about that. And most of the time when I give these presentations, I look forward to people who are global warming supporters because I want to commiserate with you. As Chris Hart was kind enough to mention, when I first looked at climate change, it was almost by accident. I had accepted, as most of us had, tacitly so, that mankind did have a major role in climate change. And most of it was global warming produced by industrial CO2 emissions. But once I read below the headlines and actually did my own research, I found out a totally different picture. And immediately in 2007, when I had completed fairly lengthy research into solar activity, I issued my first press release. I later published a peer-reviewed research paper on this subject and began the Space and Science Research Corporation. But in 2007, April 26th at 2 p.m., I had my scientific eureka moment where all that came together was that the sun was the primary driver and we were going into a dangerous cold era. Since that time, I've dedicated myself, spoken throughout the U.S., and I've even been invited overseas to speak. But right now, my focus is getting all our American citizens aware of what's coming. The most important message that you just heard has a second component. Why should you believe a word I'm saying tonight? Especially since after 25 years of propaganda, most of you should believe that mankind is the only controller of our climate change. The reason you should believe me is that it has been independently verified that the Space and Science Research Corporation has the best track record for climate prediction in the United States. No one else comes close, not even close. The reason for that and why we are so far more accurate and reliable in climate prediction compared to our own U.S. government and the United Nations is very simple. We follow cycles of the sun. We do not follow the greenhouse gas theory. In fact, of the 24 climate parameters that we measure and we publish in our biannual global climate status report, CO2 is not even in there. Not even in there. Certainly mankind's CO2 is not even in there. So this is the meat of our subject tonight. I'm going to quickly go through everything else, but it's important that you understand where I'm coming from, and I want you to know that up front. I've got a cartoon up here and a couple more. The reason is because scientists and engineers have terrible senses of humor. We couldn't make up a joke if our life depended on it. And it's very difficult to even tell a joke if our life depended on it. So bear with me, I have to bring in humor because I don't have any of my own. Here we have a very typical picture of two men standing up to their elbows in snow asking, what's wrong with global warming after all? Certainly in the last few winters we've had a lot of reasons to feel as these two gentlemen. Here's another picture of someone that looks like President Obama. Says, don't worry, I hear your concerns about global warming, and there's a homeless man freezing and shivering, snow-covered, sitting next to a news kiosk that says record low temps, Obama touts tax to stop global warming. And here's one of my favorites I just got on the web from some friends. It's very difficult to see with this lighting, but let me explain. You've got two futuristic astronauts in their little spacecraft. In the background, you see a futuristic city that is Florida. And it's surrounded by glaciers. And buried in the ice on the left of the screen, you have some kind of ancient human with a sign that says, "Stop Global Warming." And the caption says, Phil and James discover an interesting artifact from the 21st century, imbecile man.
Where can I get these pictures?
Send me an email, I'll send them to you. This is an eye chart. If you'll put your hand over one eye and try to read the screen. No, you don't have to do that. You see why we are so bad at jokes, we don't try to get into this. This eye chart, however, has a lot of information. I'll quickly go through it. The Space and Science Research Corporation, as mentioned by Chris, is right here in Orlando. We are also heavily dependent on contributions, donations, sales of our books, sales of our climate reports. Global cooling has no patronage in the U.S. government right now, or anyone in Washington, D.C. We have no budget line on anyone's budget. We have no money. Global cooling is not funded, and global cooling is the only climate that we have right now. If you want money from the government and you're a research scientist, all you have to do is submit a grant, say whatever you're going to do, even if it's counting sheep, will contribute to global warming, you'll get money for it. But I cannot get money by saying I'm talking about global cooling. It just doesn't happen. I've spent a lot of time going back and forth to Washington over the years. My wife can attest to that, especially after the Challenger accident. I've been to the White House a number of times. I am not welcome in this White House. No surprise. What we have to do, however, is do the best we can, and we have done that, again, independently, the best track record for climate prediction in the U.S. There are a number of articles out. Dr. Rich Swire authored most of those, but there are others now. Bottom line is kind of interesting. It says that I'm probably the most criticized climate researcher in the U.S. by Al Gore, left-wing media, and environmental extremists. That is quite accurate, quite accurate. I am in many cases Al Gore's opposite, especially financially. Al Gore has made a great deal of money, as we all know, pushing man-made global warming. He's had an Oscar, he's got a Nobel Prize. I don't know if there are any other prizes to give this guy, but he's certainly been given a lot of money by a lot of people that believe what he was saying. In our case, what we're after is the truth. That's what you're going to hear tonight. We're not after riches. We want to keep the lights on, but we're here to give you the real truth about the climate. Cindy, if you can give me a high sign when I've only got 15 minutes left, because I want to make sure we got at least 15 minutes of question and answer. On the screen here on the left side, you see a cover of my book, Dark Winter. We have them in the back. Dark Winter is a updated, revised version of my original book, Cold Sun, which came out in 2011. This came out in September of last year. Very honored, deeply so, that Newsmax Media, headed by Chris Ruddy, which publishes Newsmax magazine and does many other things, has picked up on my book. They bought the rights. They have a nationwide campaign, which has become very successful. As of this week, Dark Winter is now the #1 global cooling climate book in the United States on the Amazon list. Thank you. The picture, it's hard to see on the right, is the Global Climate Status Report. That is, again, a truthful, accurate, non-governmental report, therefore, that we publish, and there's a handful of researchers and scientists and authors that cooperate with me on this report every 6 months. The last one just came out December the 2nd, and that report, you can go online to get it at spaceandscience.net. There you can find much other information. You can actually find a free 4-page report, which gives you the big picture on the climate, if you want to know what the status and the future is. But the 44-page report, you can get that online, or you can order it at the desk back there later. It is the only such report published in the United States today. Very sad, ladies and gentlemen, very sad indeed. There should be many John Caseys, there should be many such climate reports, but right now there's only one. And we need your support to keep that news going, that report going, and the story about what's really happening with the climate. Both the book Dark Winter and the Global Climate Report have been reviewed and endorsed by prominent international scientists. This is not a John Casey only program we're talking about. It was originally when I began, certainly. And in fact, when I first made my announcement, you can imagine the response I got. It was 2007, 2008. You had two guys running for president. They both said that global warming was real and they were going to fix it. Al Gore was getting the Nobel Peace Prize. So no one wanted to hear what John Casey had just announced, that global warming was going to end within 3 years and a new cold era was starting. That totally pulled the rug out from under the theory of greenhouse gases, much less the president's plan. Obviously, with no money and no political prestige and no credibility. My initial critics said I had no credibility in climate. They were absolutely right. A lot of the initial criticism that I got back then was because I didn't have a PhD, I didn't have a science, 100 science research papers under my belt. I had the ability, obviously, to dig into these kinds of things, and that's what I had been doing for decades before, tackling tough science and engineering problems. That's why NASA asked me to come in and help investigate the Challenger accident. But I never had the time. Once I had the time, I realized what was happening, and now you know the rest of the story. But I had no credibility. Even today, 8 years later, I still have people that, in the media, for example, that remember the first report they saw about me in 2007 that said I had no credibility, and they still give me that today. They said, well, we're not going to print your article, we're not going to buy your report because you have no credibility. I still hear that today. Even though, for years now, we have been the #1 climate prediction center in the United States. Interesting story. But these are some of the comments from other scientists. I'll pass on these. I'll be glad to provide them later. They're on the back of the book. They're at the website as well. And this is the Cold Truth Initiative from Newsmax Media. Basically, all I want you to do is go to newsmax.com/darkwinter, newsmax.com/darkwinter. They have a wonderful program. You can get my book and some other things just for a $5 contribution. When you check off what you do or do not want, bear in mind they're going to try to convince you to get some of their other newsletters and publications. But you can select what you do and do not want. But truly, for $5, you can get my book mailed to you. It won't be signed like the one on the back, but you can still get it. And I recommend that program. So what's the weather been like lately? Well, this winter has gotten an early start. We warmed up a little, but now we're going back into another cold phase. It's the up and down we typically see in winters, although what we're seeing typically in the last few winters is atypical. We're not seeing the kinds of things we were told we should see, which is very little, if any, snow, much warmer temperatures. It's not happening. In fact, this winter thus far started early again in November, well over a month before the official start of winter, and yet in the month of November we saw over 4,000 new cold temperature records from 4,000 different monitoring stations. Over 1,200 new cold and snow records. A lot of these records are 100, 150 years old. And in the case of poor folks in Buffalo, 7 feet of snow broke their all-time record for snow. 7 feet of snow. These aren't the only snow records we're seeing. We've seen 16 feet of snow in Japan. We've seen 18 feet of snow within 36 hours in Alaska. You expect Alaska to have some snow, but not 18 feet. Unusual things are happening that are not supposed to happen. That's the message. And our winter this year is saying the same thing. Vietnam, I just saw the picture of Vietnam, 20 centimeters, about 10 inches of snow covering their rice paddies in Vietnam. Any Vietnam vets in here, by the way? Okay. I'll tell you from my friends and fellow military guys that went over there, it ain't that cold, or it wasn't that cold. It is now. It is now. And when the rice starts to get frozen over, the rest of Asia has a real problem. Jacksonville had snow flurries, what, a week ago? 2 weeks ago? Pensacola set a record of 20 degrees. That's too cold for Florida, ladies and gentlemen. I keep telling my wife, Alicia, that we're too far north. We live in Orlando. 4 of the last 6 winters have been unusual, if not brutal winters. Record-setting cold, record-setting snow. And spring of 2013, most people were never told this, we came within 2 weeks of an utter agricultural disaster. Within just 2 weeks, we almost lost all the corn, all the wheat, and all the soybeans. I've been warning for years this is coming. It almost happened in the spring planting of 2013. It was so wet and so cold that they couldn't get their first crops in, couldn't plant them. This is how it's going to happen. And when it does happen, it's going to hit everyone between the eyes. Because there's no option if there's no food in the field. If there are no crops in the field, there's no option. We can't go to the warehouse because we don't store food anymore like we used to. In many major farming communities up north, from the combine to the truck to the train to the port to the ship to China, that's the route of most of our wheat, corn, and soybeans. We just don't store. We just don't. This year was a little exception. We had a bumper crop in corn, wheat, and soybeans, thank goodness. But the poor farmers, they always get stuck. Too much supply, prices drop. So they bought silos now, and they stored as much as they can. But that's not going to get us through a bad climate freeze like we're about to get. So we've had a rough winter already. Before this winter, we've already forgotten, we've had disastrous cold and snow events. October 11, Snow-Tober. The Northeast, for those of you who were up there or had friends and family up there, it was pounded relentlessly by snow and cold. Millions of people were out of power. Hundreds of thousands were out of power for weeks on end. It was a terrible event, record-setting for the entire Northeast. October 2013, never forget this. I was speaking with the news people in South Dakota. 6, 8, 10 feet of snow covering much of southwest South Dakota. Tens of thousands of cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, goats, you name it, totally covered with snow. They couldn't find their livestock. The livestock froze and died in the field by the tens of thousands. Never happened before. It's not supposed to be happening. But why is it happening? Why are these unusual weather events happening at all? Item 5 addresses the Snow-Tober and the big snow in South Dakota in October 13. These happened 2 months before the start of winter. 2 months before December the 31st. December the 21st, before the start of winter. Why are we having winter start so early and be so damaging? It's not supposed to happen. None of these events, especially last year, which USA Today said was one of the worst record-setting, most brutal winters we've ever recorded, globally, not just here in the US. But none of these things are supposed to happen. Within the last 10 years, all the predictions of the global warming, Al Gore, Obama, UN crowd have said without question, we're not going to see any more snow. The Arctic sea ice is going to disappear completely by 2008 and then 2013. And the goalpost keeps moving. But instead of things disappearing, what we have is more of them, more cold, more snow, more difficult times, more people without power. This is only going to get worse. That's the trend. That's what's happening. What we've been told is not happening. So what's the current status of the planet? Let me give it to you up front so there's no question. 18 long years, ladies and gentlemen, there has been no global warming. What does that mean? It means that effectively there's been no real increase in the temperature of the planet's atmosphere in the lower troposphere for almost 2 decades. That also means that for most of the time we have been told that mankind's CO2 is going to make the planet warmer and warmer and warmer and create more and more global warming. There was no global warming. For 18 long years we've been told about something that does not exist. For 18 long years, the UN, typically Democratic Party, but not necessarily. I mentioned the Republicans running for president, John McCain. He believed in global warming. He said we need to fix it. He was wrong. We've been told a bunch of things by UN scientists, by climate reports in the US and our own US government that are simply not true. Simply not true. Ladies and gentlemen, this is astounding. For 18 years there's been no global warming, and yet that's all we hear. I will tell you what we don't hear. What we don't hear is the fact that the Earth is cooling rapidly. When was the last time you saw that on the front page of the Orlando Sentinel or heard it on ABC, NBC, CBS, or Fox News? Haven't. You haven't. No one's standing up and telling you the truth. That's what we're going to do tonight, though. The oceans have been cooling for 11 years. 11 long years the oceans have been cooling. Ladies and gentlemen, when we have a planet made up of 71% oceans and they are cooling, guess what that means? It means everything's going to get cold. Everything is going to get cold. That's why for most of that time, and according to one major climate data set, the atmosphere has also been cooling for 11 years. We use 7, but I'll show you a chart that shows 11. Right now, the Atlantic Ocean has shifted. It's gone from warming, it's now going into cooling. The Pacific has already been cooling for 30 years. No one's been telling you that. But that's why the salmon and the herring and the other populations have come back big time out there. They're not threatened anymore. It was never about overfishing anyway. It was about Mother Nature. There's a 60-year cycle going on in the Pacific, and it affects sea life. There's a lot of natural cycles that we're not told about that do control the climate, and that's what we're talking about tonight, in particular a 206-year cycle that's controlling the climate. This one occurs almost like clockwork. It's the one I announced to the White House and the mainstream media in April and May of 2007, which no one believed. But of course, that was just the first announcement. I made a number of other announcements, issued press releases and predictions, all of which, over 11 of them, have come true or are in the process of coming true. This is difficult to read, so bear with me. I'll speak to you and hopefully we'll get through all of these. We have heard so much about the Arctic Sea ice melting, right? We've heard about Antarctic melting. We've heard about Greenland melting. None of that is true. None of it is true. It used to be true, absolutely. When the sun was warm, when that 206-year cycle was at its warming peak, absolutely. They were all melting to an extent, not Antarctica, believe it or not. That never melted, never got warmer. But the Arctic was, Greenland was, mountain glaciers seemed to be, but that ended shortly after 1998. Since then, all of the sea ice and all of the ice in general on the planet began to rebound. I'll show you the charts on that. But right now, at the poles, it's colder than it has ever been, in many cases, since 1979. We now know that the sea ice is more voluminous than it has ever been before. I have the charts on that. But you won't get the federal government to tell you that. You won't see it on the evening news, and you won't see it in your newspaper. We have the data. It's in our global climate report. Polar bears. Are polar bears threatened, going extinct? You'd think so if you listen to the major news carriers, the major media outlets. The truth is vastly different than what we've been told. I've spent a lot of time digging into the truth, and I published it in my book, Cold Sun and Now Dark Winter. The threatening story of threatened polar bears is absolute fraud from the word go. Absolute fraud, 100% fraud. Polar bears have never been threatened since 1960. Since 1960, polar bear populations have increased 250% because of global warming. Global warming has been wonderful to polar bears. They have now overpopulated, and according to many biologists, they are threatening other bear species more south of them. Furthermore, the Canadian government has just published a study within the last 6 months that says in eastern Canada, they now have so many polar bears that they are threatening the entire population by overpopulation. Unbelievable. And yet, what do we hear from the environmental groups? What do we hear from our own government? What do we hear, what did we used to hear from Senate and House committees? chaired by Democrats, pushing the global warming agenda. We heard that polar bears are threatened. If we don't stop global warming, we won't have any more polar bears. Absolute fraud. Absolute fraud. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you, being a scientist engineer type for decades, these are the worst times for scientific integrity in the United States history, if not global history. We have a president who swore that he would do many things, which he hasn't done, but one of them was he would restore scientific integrity to the White House and the US government. It has been just the opposite. We are now at the bottom of the barrel in scientific integrity. And this is just a good example, the polar bear politics, as I call it. The bottom line on this chart is what I have said in my book and said many times on radio, on TV, and in every presentation I've given since 2007. The greenhouse gas theory, as it is applied to climate change and using mankind's industrial CO2 as the main driver, this theory, this concept, is the greatest international scientific fraud in the history of mankind. It far exceeds that of the Catholic Church throwing Galileo into prison and then house confinement in the 1615s for saying that the sun was the center of the solar system. By the way, does anyone not believe that? Yeah, he was right then. And regrettably, the church is going back down that path by signing on to global warming, even though many Catholics and Catholic leaders are about to tell the Pope he's got the wrong advisors in the Vatican. But that's how I believe the situation is. We've been victims of, I have too, the greatest scientific fraud in history. The current climate status, at the end of the story, and in my book, and especially in the Global Climate Report, has two scenarios for the future. And this goes back to the meat of my message in my first chart with you. The two scenarios include, number one, we're going into a cold period that will be 200-year record-setting cold, the coldest that it's been since 1793 to 1830, also called a Dalton minimum. That was the last time we had this solar hibernation phenomenon. That's what the Space and Science Research Corporation currently predicts will happen. However, that's not the only prediction. We include another one that the Russian colleagues we have are now telling us about, which is that we have calculated too lightly on how severe this cold will be. They're saying, no, it's not going to be like it was 200 years ago. It's going to be like it was 400 years ago. Two iterations of the solar hibernation cycle. Two iterations of the 206-year cycle. Back to when it was a little ice age. From 1615 to 1745, the planet was so bitterly cold that massive crop failure was the norm. Massive starvation was the norm. Political upheaval and warfare was the norm. Not the exception, but the norm. Worldwide disease and outbreaks of disease were the norm. We hope the Russians are wrong. We will know which scenario will be coming our way within the next 4 to 6 years, because we're leaving solar cycle 24, we're going into solar cycle 25, and 25 and 26 are the worst cycles that we foresee and that the Russians foresee. By the way, it's curious to note the Russians are totally free to talk about global cooling. We are not. We are not. If a university scientist or a government scientist stands up and says, John Casey's been right all these years, we are heading into a new cold era, that person will be fired, will be blacklisted, will no longer be seen in public, because we punish scientists for telling the truth. That's what's happening in our country right now. It gets back to my comment about scientific integrity. That's unfortunately what happens. I had a friend at NASA say, John, don't call me anymore. I can't speak to you. I've had 3 universities tell me they cannot have me on their campus to brief college students and tell them the truth about the climate. One went so far as to set up special dinners in my honor. You name it. They were going to put on the dog and put on the feed bag and really treat me royally when I came to their university. And then one of their staff up in their ivory towers read my book, and immediately everything got canceled. It was a good financial decision. I don't dispute why they made the decision. If they had allowed me on campus, that would have been the end of their climate research funding from the federal government. John Casey, like him or not, is toxic at a university right now. They can't afford to have me come there. Hopefully that will change soon. And we can start salvaging the young minds that for 25 years have heard nothing but mankind runs the planet and runs the climate. And the sun has no important role in climate change. Unbelievable. When you think about it, what do you mean the sun has no major role in climate change? It's unbelievable, but that's what we've been told, and that's what 40 to 50% of the people in the United States believe today. Because propaganda, long enough, regardless of how incredible the story is, can be effective. Someone, I think, learned that in World War II. What was his name? Adolf something or other. Our world is about to change dramatically. We as a nation and a species are totally unprepared for what's coming. This is another aspect of learning from the past. George Santayana, the philosopher, had a well-known phrase, those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. Words to that effect. That's what's happening again. It's simply history repeating. It's simply the sun repeating in its cycles of change. And we're all going to go through this again. I want every one of you in here to listen and act on what I'm saying tonight, and we're going to talk about how to prepare for what's coming, and I'll come back to this issue. It's very difficult to change one's thinking after 25 years of propaganda. So what did happen the last time the solar hibernation hit? Back in 1793 to 1830. War broke out all over the world, but the ones we remember from our school, either high school or college, was France and Great Britain went to war again. They went to war against Russia. The entire European continent was at war at the bottom of the last solar hibernation. Great Britain went to war with the U.S. again, or vice versa. We didn't like them impressing our seamen, so we said, we've had enough of this. But war was everywhere. The cold and the snow was so bad in the United States that thousands of American citizens froze to death and starved to death. And bear in mind back then, there was no government subsidy, no food stamps. Everyone fed themselves. They had their own farm. They had their own firewood, their own furnace. They took care of themselves. They had hogs and cattle and sheep. Whatever they needed, they could grow their own crops. They didn't have the storage technology for food that we have today, but otherwise everyone was self-sufficient back then. There was no government assistance, and no one expected any government to assist them. And yet thousands and thousands died and froze to death. Crops worldwide were destroyed, not just here in the U.S. By the way, a footnote, Thomas Jefferson, who became president, had his crops wiped out. He had to take out a loan because he lost all his crops. It's not just cold and snow and crop damage that occurs. We don't know the mechanism. I wish there was money devoted to global cooling research so we could go find out. But what we do know is that there's only one barrel of the shotgun that we've talked about, and that's the coal barrel. There's another barrel to this two-barrel shotgun. That's geophysical disasters that occur at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, the very worst earthquakes and the very worst volcanic eruptions also happen at the same time the sun goes into hibernation. There are multiple theories. Some deal with the warming and the cooling of the Earth's mantle that causes contractions and expansions, and somehow along the way earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur. But there's no real science and no real money put into it. But we do know, to a very high degree of correlation, and we published more research on this in the previous, not the December 10 Global Climate Report, but the one before that, very detailed report I co-authored with 3 other eminent scientists, and we showed exactly when these occur and how often the worst earthquakes and volcanoes occur. The last time we had a solar hibernation, the world's worst recorded ever series of earthquakes occurred right here in the United States. Not in China, not in Australia, not in Indonesia, not in Turkey. Right here in the United States. They occurred in the New Madrid Fault. Those of you from the Missouri area probably heard that, Tennessee. I was born in Blytheville, Arkansas, dead center in the New Madrid Fault. I swear, you go out, and I've never forgotten this, even as a young kid. I'd go out and pick cotton, hoe beans with my granddad. We had sharecroppers on the farm back then. And we'd all go out there, and we'd be going down the row, and things would be looking good, and then all of a sudden, white sand and nothing for 20 yards. And we'd go to another part of the field, same thing. Everything would be perfect. We'd be hoeing beans, pulling cotton, whatever we were doing, and then all of a sudden, white sand for 20 yards. Where did the white sand come from in the middle of these rich farm fields? It came from the New Madrid Fault and the earthquakes that caused geysers of liquefied sand to spout into the air. This occurred throughout the central United States around the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was lifted up and the Mississippi flowed northwards. This was so powerful until it redirected itself and began to find another way to come south. Within 3 months, we had 2 7.5s and an 8.0 magnitude earthquake. Unbelievable destruction, geophysical destruction. There was hardly any people there. We're talking 1811, 1812 in the dead of winter. There were some fur traders on the Mississippi, some early settlers, some Indian tribes. That's it. If that happened today, it'd be a totally different story. Our economy would be shut down. Most of the major transports of food and fuel would be broken. The bridges across the Mississippi, for much of the Mississippi, would be broken and torn down. It would be an economic disaster if it occurred. And you can't go back in and fix it. You cannot go back in because you're going to have another 7.0 or 8.0 earthquake hit you a few months later and tear down everything that you've rebuilt. You can't go back in. Imagine Arkansas, Tennessee, St. Louis, Indiana, where you can't go. You can't go into those states. That's how bad it was. It could happen again. We also had the worst volcanic eruptions ever recorded. Now, we've heard about Krakatoa. We've heard about Vesuvius and Pompeii. We may have heard of some others. We've heard about Mount St. Helens, of course, May 18th, 1980. But nothing compares with what happened April of 1815 in Indonesia. Mount Tambora exploded, worst ever volcanic eruption. By the time the dust and gas had spread around the world, we were already deep in a cold era. We had already had some other volcano, which we cannot find yet, in 1809 that was a major volcanic eruption, put more dust and debris and sulfuric acid into the air. And yet, in 1816, it was so cold in the United States, we had no summer. It was like winter in the middle of summer in the United States in 1816. Famously called a year without a summer, or 1816 and froze to death. That's what they called it back then. All the crops were destroyed. All the crops north of the Mason-Dixon line were wiped out. Couldn't plant them to start off with, it was so cold. When they did plant them, in June, July, and middle of August, we had snow and frost on the crops. Everything was wiped out. And this wasn't just the U.S. A lot of sections of the planet, especially in southern Europe, were also hit similarly. We expect again, and in fact the cycle's already begun. The worst earthquakes and volcanoes have already begun again. We've already had some. March 2011, the great Japanese earthquake, 9.0 plus. The great Andaman earthquake, 2004, December the 26th, wiped out 230,000 people in the Indian and Pacific area. The cycle has already begun again. The destruction was so bad on the crops because of the cold and the destruction because of the volcanic and earthquakes. The historian John D. Post said that era, that solar hibernation, was the world's worst subsistence crisis ever recorded. That was only 200 years ago. It's coming again, ladies and gentlemen. We have to be prepared for the very worst. And our latest look at what's happening in Indonesia is not good at all. We've got very active volcanic activity very near some of the world's largest supervolcanoes. This is scary stuff. We need to have an international effort to monitor what's going on in Indonesia right now, and likewise southern Chile. Southern Chile also had a big volcanic eruption, and it shut down all air traffic from South America to southern Asia. This is a picture by Adolf Northern. It's a picture of what happened when Napoleon didn't pay attention to the climate. 1812, 1813, he launched an invasion of Russia with 600,000. It was a devastating campaign. He did kill a lot of Russians, got to Moscow. They had evacuated, burned all their food. There was nothing to live on. And so he decided to go back to Paris. By the time he got back, he only had 40,000. The vast majority of people didn't die because of combat. They died from deprivation by cold and starvation. He did not have a climate expert who studied global cooling to tell him what to do or where to go. This is a picture of the central area for the new Madrid Fault. This is a picture, and in the inset you see Southeast Asia. You see a small red rectangle which represents the larger picture. In the dead center you see what looks like a bullseye. That's the remaining caldera of what used to be a 4,800 meter tall mountain. It lost 2,000 meters when it blew off its top, and a caldera 6 kilometers across was created, Mount Tambora in Indonesia. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I have a sister company called the International Earthquake and Volcano Prediction Center. It's made up of some of the world's best people, best experts in earthquakes and volcanic activity. They came to me after they saw what I was doing with climate research and said, we need your help with earthquake prediction because we can now predict earthquakes. By the way, the federal government says you can't do that. You can't predict climate either, except with CO2 and EPA regulations. We've been predicting major earthquakes. We have been doing it. And right now, just to the northeast, between that bullseye in the middle and that inset, we just had a major earthquake. Haven't had one in many years near that volcano. If Mount Tambora is waking up again, we got big problems. This is a picture of the Puyehue Cordon Calle volcanic eruption. I apologize for the difficulty in seeing this. Let's get into some data real quick. I want to get to the Q&A very quick. This shows the 100-year temperature chart. Off to the upper right, you see a steep drop in global temperatures. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not warming, we are cooling. This is the most recent global temperature chart using the 5 global climate data sets that we use at the Space and Science Research Corporation. If you can look at this chart, it's a little hard to see. The year 2003 to 2007 was the peak. It's been cooling ever since. Forget what the government's telling you about global warming. There is none. There has been none for 18 long years. Here's the most recent December 2014 temperature chart. We've heard about NASA and NOAA announcing that 2014 was the warmest. It's on the far right. Does it look the warmest to anyone in here? Hell no. Pardon my français. You can tell without any education, without being head of an investigation on the Challenger accident, a degree in physics or math, or 30 or 40 years in science and engineering, this chart tells you right away the government's not telling you the truth. Very sad, very sad. This comes from remote sensing systems. They are a government-contracted single integrator of global satellite temperature data. These people have the data. They distribute it to everyone else that makes up the other 4 or 5 data sets that we use, but these guys have the original data. They do the original analysis. These guys know what's happening. Okay, I'm going to quickly go to skip through. This chart shows you, far right, growth in Arctic sea ice, and on the top, the red line, growth in Antarctic sea ice. We now have more sea ice than we've ever had since the satellite era began in '79. Sea levels are now at peak. On the far right, you see over the year 2000, that's the projected peak, and now they're going to be dropping for the next 50 years. No more sea level rise, ladies and gentlemen. We had a news conference August the 21st, 2013 in Miami and announced it. Did you see it on the evening news, Miami Herald, Orlando Sentinel? No, they're not telling you the truth, ladies and gentlemen. This shows you in the year 2031 on the far right, by sunspot count, when the next cold era will be. This was my original calculation done back in 2007. NASA says 2014 was the warmest year, and they also said it says that global warming's coming back. The answer is no on both. On the far right, you see the current 11-year solar cycle measuring sunspot counts. It's hard to see, but every one of the sunspot counts for each solar cycle in front of it. Far right's 24, then you got 23, 22, and 21. At the very top, you see a squiggly line. There's a double peak. At each of the peaks of a global, at each peak of an 11-year solar cycle, there's a double peak. History says that the first peak is always the most prominent, the most energetic. But in our current solar cycle 24, the second peak is the most energetic, the most prominent. There's only 2 occasions in history when this has happened before. The last one occurred before the major cold cycle of 1910. The one before occurred before the 2006 206-year solar hibernation from 1793 to 1830. Ladies and gentlemen, the sun just warmed us up a bit, not a lot, but enough, and sent us a message. He's about to pull the rug out from under the global temperature curve, and we're heading into global cold. This is the sun's final signal. It's a false flag. It's a sneaky false flag by the sun to warm us up, fool with a head fake, NASA and NOAA, and in the next few years pull the rug out from under us. This is the final signal. This is all we who study solar physics needed to see to know what's happening. Okay, how do we prepare? The toughest number 1 step is you need to change what your thinking is. You need to help your friends and family and your neighbors adjust to 25 years of propaganda and change from what you've been told to what the facts now tell us. You need to study and get informed of what's happening. Get my book, get the Global Climate Report, go online to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, get whatever material you can read about the next cold climate era, and learn and read, study history, and see what happened before, so you'll know how to prepare. Step number 3, you must have at least a 1-year food supply, ladies and gentlemen, and you need it for 2 reasons. Number 1, you don't want to be caught in the panic that's about to hit. It almost happened in spring of 2013. By the grace of God and some warming at the right time, we got through the planting in 2013. It could have begun right then. The first real panic could have begun right then. You must have that 1-year food supply for that reason. There's a good financial reason for doing it. Food's going up 3 to 4% every year across the board. Meat went up 18% last year. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're not buying canned meat right now, you're going to pay through the nose for it later. And some of this stuff you can get from your local grocer. It lasts many years. You don't have to go buy the 25-year freeze-dried, but I recommend you get some of that too. If the Russians are correct, ladies and gentlemen, then what I'm telling you to now is the mild case of what we're facing. If, in fact, the Russians are correct and we go into a little ice age, the death, destruction, the devastation global will be biblical in scale. That means I can't even calculate how bad it'll be. I hope the Russians are wrong. We'll know within 3 to 6 years, 4 to 6 years. And you must assume that everyone around you will be totally unprepared, shocked, and go into panic mode. That's really going to be tough to see, but we're going to see it nationwide. Globally, we're going to see it. In Florida, we've seen this before, haven't we not? When a hurricane comes in, the lines get ridiculous at the Publix and at the local gas station. People are bringing in carts, people are bringing in trucks. I mean, I've seen, I can't forget the picture I saw in my head, of people driving up with trucks, pickup trucks, with gas tanks in the back of the pickup. They're filling up by hundreds of gallons. That's the kind of lunacy that we're going to see in the future. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, just like the American adversaries, we depend on good folks helping us out. We need you to buy our books, our climate reports. Go to the website. There's a lot of free information there, too. And we also have a donation line. Thank you all very much for the chance to speak. And now, Q&A. Thank you. The question is, how did I originally determine there was a 206-year cycle? What data I used? And am I concerned about the Yellowstone area? Let me answer the second question first, because I'll forget it if I don't. I'm not concerned with Yellowstone. Yellowstone's last eruption was 640,000 years ago. On average, it occurs every 640,000 years. So people are concerned. They say, well, we're overdue or it's due. Yes, but it may not happen for 2,000 or 5,000 more years. I'm not concerned. Now, we do monitor Yellowstone. The U.S. government does. The U.S. Geological Service monitors it actively. And what we found out is that the caldera has been rising. But we also know that caldera rises and subsides on a hundreds and thousands year basis. We don't know that that says anything right now. But yes, it is still in the rising mode. So we're monitoring that closely. The threat that we face at Yellowstone and other supervolcanoes happens when you get constant swarms of earthquakes that don't stop, that continue to get more and more powerful. That's the sign. We don't see that. We do see swarms of earthquakes there, but they stop, and they never go beyond a 2 or 3 magnitude. But when you get 3 to 4, you've got a serious situation. Swarms of hundreds of earthquakes of that magnitude, then you got a serious situation. Okay, the first question was, how did I derive the 206-year cycle? Since sunspots only go back 400 years, once I had done the analysis on 400 years of sunspots, I had to use what are called solar proxies, stand-ins for sunspots. And you can get those. Fortunately, since the 50s and 70s, we had lots of ice coring done in Greenland, Antarctica. We've done deep seabeds and deep lake corings. We've done tree ring analysis from 3,000-year-old trees. We've sliced stalactites and stalagmites apart and looked at their rings, if you will, and done analysis to determine whether they have certain concentrations of proxies, oxygen-18 isotope, beryllium-10 isotope, most importantly, carbon-14. That's the one that gives us the best signal that we put the most research into, is the carbon-14. Using carbon-14 analysis, I went back, did the math, and came up with not only a 206-year cycle, but the second most powerful in the family of cycles. I discovered a 90 to 100-year cycle. After I issued my first press release, by the way, I didn't even bother to check with another scientist on this. I did all this research, came up with my relational cycle theory for climate change based on solar cycles, issued my first press release, notified my friends in the White House, and then I decided to see if anyone else had found the same thing. Sure enough, a lot of other guys had found the same thing. No one told anyone about it. The media never told anyone about it. These scientists are typically good scientists. They do their research, they write their paper, they get it published in a science journal, and then they go on and do some more research somewhere else. It gets buried in a science journal and no one ever hears about it, except a few scientists in that field. That's why I decided when I completed my first peer-reviewed research paper that defined the relational cycle theory and these cycles, I published it online so the entire world will get to see it, to critique it, to review it. I think I made the right decision. What do I think of NASA and the US government's climate research and what they're telling us? I think I probably already answered that. They're not telling us the truth. They're not telling us the full story. But that happens. Okay, you have a question, Donna.
Why are they lying? If
The question, Donna, is why aren't we being told the truth about the full range of causes and effects of climate? You have the answer to that? Money? Any other one? Any other answers? Money, power, prestige, anything that influence buys when you tell any kind of story. Hopefully it's truthful, but in this case it hasn't been truthful. Certainly not complete. I will tell you the fundamental difference between the global warming and the solar physics communities is the global warming community used a greenhouse gas theory, which has been a weak theory for 110 years, and turned it into a political tool. We use very strong, reliable, 90% reliable solar physics climate theories, and we use it not for politics, but to take care of our people, to get them prepared. That's the big difference between the two communities. Two questions. One is hurricanes, and the other is what about the droughts? Hurricanes first. I couldn't be happier with what happened with the hurricanes in terms of their intensity, numbers, cycle, and duration. With the exception of the fact in 2004, one took our roof off. Well, not exactly, but we had to get a new one put on, Hurricane Charlie. We had 3 hurricanes go over our house in 2004. Luck of the draw. But what we saw from the chart up here was something very important. Oceanic temperatures peaked in what year? 3. Peaked in 2003. There was latent heat built up, which lasted for 3 more years. That's what happens. You heat up something, put it in the microwave. What's the instructions on when you heat something in the microwave? Don't touch it. It's still heating up after it's turned off. The Earth's the same way. We're still heating up after the sun starts cutting back. The sun stopped heating the oceans in 2003, but the latent heat was still building up, and it lasted through 2007, 3 or 4 years, and that's what happened. At the very peak of ocean heating, we had the peak of hurricane activity in the United States. It was expected fully based on a study of solar physics and climate cycles. Okay, the second question was the droughts. In the relational cycle theory, I define the 206-year cycle and the 90 to 100-year cycle. I also say in the relational cycle, upon further study, we will probably add more smaller cycles. One of them I'm very close to adding with another scientist who's done excellent work on this. It's the 60-year drought cycle. The 60-year cycle is probably the best known climate cycle on the planet. More scientists are aware of this than they are of the 206-year or the 90 to 100-year. The 60-year climate cycle is like a heartbeat of the Earth's climate. Every 60 years it varies. Doesn't matter whether we're going up in warming or going down in cooling. Every 60 years you see a blip. Every 60 years. Science is wonderful. Natural cycles are wonderful. They're so predictable, so reliable. Now, if we could get some cycles elected to Washington, boy, wouldn't that change some things. But seriously, the drought cycles that we saw in California are identical to the flood cycles in Pakistan and in drought cycles in China. You go around the planet, every 60 years, they shift. It's perfect. It's beautiful. And it's reliable, and we should start teaching these kinds of things. In high school, we can teach it. Ladies and gentlemen, my relational cycle theory, 90% effective, creating the best climate prediction record in U.S. climate history, can be taught in high school and elementary school. Every elementary and high school science teacher can become as good as I am at predicting the climate. Just let me at them. I'll teach them in a few hours and they'll know how to do it. There's an interesting piece on the Weather Channel, which is very Al Gore-ish in how they look at climate. And I have some real heartburn with them. But they did a very nice piece on some freezing rain that was hitting New York City. They went to the top of the Empire State Building. It was 44 degrees. No ice. People were up there looking around. It was kind of nice. Down at the bottom, it was 25 degrees and frozen ice everywhere. Very dangerous. 200 feet above the freezing was 30-some. So just the first 200 feet made the difference between frozen sheets of ice in New York City and none, and even warmer. So it varies quite a bit. In fact, when you get above the troposphere, the variations are even more dramatic. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to stop this. We've got to get our country back on truth, integrity, and science, and make real progress on real issues and real threats, and global cooling is now the real threat. Cindy, thank you very much.